The dust had waited 12 years to move again. It hung in the shafts of September light that broke through the boarded windows of the West Wing, disturbed at last by the crowbars of 3 workmen who had been paid handsomely to ask no questions. Each strike against the nailed planks sent a shudder through the old timbers, as though the manor itself resented being woken. She stood at the edge of the overgrown terrace, an elderly woman now, her hair the color of ash, her hands folded tightly over the head of her walking stick. Beside her, her husband watched with the same stillness he had worn for decades whenever this particular corner of the house was mentioned. A stillness that was not calm at all, but the practiced silence of a man holding something down. "You needn't watch this," he said, not for the first time. "I want to," she answered, and that ended it, as it always did. The West Wing had been sealed since the autumn of 1887. 12 years of ivy had crept up its stone face, and 12 years of village rumor had crept along with it. Whispers of a dinner that never happened, of dishes smashed and thrown to the pigs, of a housemaid dismissed in disgrace on a night no one in the family would ever fully explain. The staff who remembered it had grown old or moved on. The younger ones only knew that certain doors were not to be opened, certain rooms not to be dusted, certain questions not to be asked at the servants' table. Now the doors were being opened anyway. It had been her idea, in the end, to restore the wing before it collapsed entirely into the earth, to fill it again with light and laughter for their granddaughter's wedding breakfast in the spring. A practical decision, dressed up as a happy one. But practicality had never been the whole of it, and both of them knew it. There was a debt buried somewhere in those closed rooms, unpaid and unspoken, and perhaps, though neither said it aloud, a hope that opening the wing might finally let something out. The foreman called for them as the last of the boards came away from the old dining room doors, revealing the long-abandoned table beneath a shroud of sheeting and cobweb, exactly as it had been left. Neither of them moved to look inside. "Is there something particular you're wanting done in there, my lord?" the foreman asked, wiping his hands on his trousers. "The game larder beyond. It's got a false wall of sorts. Old-fashioned thing, hollow behind the paneling. We'll knock it through when we get to it, unless you'd rather leave it." The old man's face did not change, but his wife's fingers tightened, just slightly, on the head of her stick. "Leave nothing," she said quietly. "Open all of it." She did not know yet what waited behind that panel, but some old instinct, long dulled by years of silence, told her that whatever had been buried in 1887 had not finished speaking. 28 years before that door had ever been sealed, a young woman had stood before it for the first time, her hands folded tight over a small carpet bag, her boots still dusty from the long walk up from the village station. It was March, and the wind off the Surrey Downs had cut through her good wool coat as though it were nothing at all, but she had not shivered, not where anyone could see her. The manor had seemed to her, that first afternoon, less like a house than a small kingdom unto itself, gray stone walls climbing 3 stories into a sky heavy with the promise of rain, ivy combed neatly away from the windows, a line of yew hedges trimmed so precisely they might have been drawn with a ruler. She had been told to come to the servants' entrance, of course, and she had, and there she'd waited nearly 20 minutes on the step before the housekeeper, a narrow, iron-haired woman with a ring of keys at her belt, had opened the door and looked her over as though inspecting a bolt of cloth for flaws. "You'll be the new girl, then," the housekeeper had said, not quite a question, and led her through a maze of low corridors, smelling of beeswax and coal smoke, without once asking her name, in a manner that suggested she cared to remember it. The other servants had been polite, in the particular way that meant watchfulness rather than warmth. The cook had set a plate before her at the long kitchen table, but positioned herself, quite deliberately, at the far end of the bench. The scullery maid had asked, with an air of idle curiosity that fooled no one, where exactly she had come from, and how long she meant to stay, as though employment itself were a temporary inconvenience she might soon tire of. Above stairs, she had been presented to the family only briefly. The master of the house, a broad, serious man, not yet 40, his wife pale and precise in gray silk, their children peering from behind a doorway with open, unguarded curiosity that their parents did not share. No one had been unkind. That was the strange part of it, she would think later. No one had said a cruel word, but there had been a distance in every glance, a carefulness in every instruction repeated twice, as though her understanding, her competence, her very trustworthiness were things yet to be proven rather than assumed. She had said nothing of it that first night, lying in the narrow attic room beneath the eaves, listening to the house settle and creak around her like some great sleeping animal. She had only resolved, as she always did in strange houses, to watch, to listen, to learn the shape of things before the shape of things could be used against her. She could not have known, that first cold night, how soon that habit would matter more than anyone in the house could imagine. Edmund Harrington arrived on a Thursday, in a hired carriage that clattered up the long gravel drive as though it meant to announce him before he had even stepped down. Amara watched from the upstairs corridor window, a stack of fresh linens in her arms, as he emerged in a coat of fine gray wool, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the muddy roads he must have traveled. He was a handsome man, broad through the shoulders like his brother, but where the master of the house wore his seriousness, like a coat too heavy for the season, Edmund wore his charm, like something he had been born into and had never once had to earn. The whole household seemed to brighten at his arrival. The children ran down the front steps before anyone could stop them, and he caught them both in his arms, laughing, lifting the younger one onto his shoulders, as though he had done it 100 times before. The mistress of the house, usually so precise and contained, allowed herself a real smile. Even the master's shoulders seemed to ease, just slightly, at the sight of his brother. Amara said nothing, of course. She only carried the linens where they were meant to go and returned to her duties, but she found herself watching him in the days that followed the way she watched everything new in a house, quietly, without appearing to. It was his gloves she noticed first. He wore them constantly, even indoors, even at breakfast, removing them only at the table itself, and when he did, his hands beneath were unmarked, soft, the nails clean and shaped as a gentleman's ought to be. There was nothing wrong in that, she told herself. Many gentlemen kept such hands. And yet he spoke so often, so warmly, of his rambles through the woods and hedgerows as a boy, of gathering berries and mushrooms with his late father, of a love for the wild Surrey countryside that he claimed had never left him. A man who spoke that way, she thought, ought to have hands that showed some memory of brambles and damp earth. Then there was the book. She found it while dusting the guest room on the second morning of his stay, a handsome volume on the edible fungi of the English countryside, bound in green cloth, its spine uncracked, its pages so crisp and unhandled that she was certain, holding it a moment longer than she ought, that it had never once been opened. It sat upon his nightstand, as though placed there for effect, the way one might display a book one wished others to believe they read. She set it down exactly as she had found it, and said nothing to anyone. It was a small thing. It was, perhaps, nothing at all. But she had learned long ago that houses full of nothing did not usually contain so many small, careful arrangements of appearance. and she found herself, against her better judgment, beginning to watch Edmund Harrington a good deal more closely than politeness required. The rain had settled into the kind of steady autumn drizzle that made the old stones of the manor look darker, older, more reluctant to give up their secrets. 12 years had passed since that ruined evening, and now the West Wing stood open to workmen for the first time since it had been sealed. Dust sheets pulled from furniture that had waited in silence, windows unshuttered to let in gray light that seemed almost apologetic for arriving so late. She stood now in the corridor outside what had once been the game larder, an elderly woman with silver threaded-through hair that had once been dark, her hands folded before her, the way they had always been when she was thinking hard about something. Beside her, her husband, grayer now, stooped slightly with the years, but still carrying himself with the quiet authority of a man who had once run every corner of this estate, watched the workmen struggle with a door that refused to yield. "It's swollen through," one of them said, wiping his brow despite the cool air. "Wood's warped into the frame, something fierce. Must not have been opened in years." "It hasn't," she said quietly, and something in her voice made her husband turn to look at her. "You remember it being locked?" he asked. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the door, as though it might, if she watched long enough, tell her something it had been keeping to itself all this time. "It was sealed that week," she said, "the week of the dinner. I remember because Cook complained of it, said she couldn't get to the game hooks, and your brother's man had to send down to the village for fresh hare instead." Her husband's brow furrowed, some old and half-forgotten irritation stirring in him at the mention of that dinner, that evening that had ended in such disgrace and confusion, and a housemaid dismissed in disgrace before the soup had even reached the table. He had not thought of it in years, had trained himself, in fact, not to think of it, the way one avoids pressing a bruise, long faded, but still tender, beneath the skin. "Odd," he murmured. "I don't recall ordering it locked." "Nor I," she said. The workman gave the door another shove with his shoulder, and this time it gave a fraction, a groan of old hinges and swollen wood, dust sifting down from the frame, like a held breath finally released. He paused, glancing back at them. "There's something wedged behind the panel here, milord," he said. "Feels like it's been built in, false back to the shelving, unless I'm mistaken." Her husband stepped closer despite himself, and she felt something cold and unnamed settle in her chest, some old instinct she had long dismissed as superstition, stirring awake again after all these years, as the workman reached into the dark with a crowbar and began, carefully, to pry. The wood gave another inch, and dust rose thick as smoke in the shaft of afternoon light, falling through the shuttered window, and for a moment neither of them spoke, both caught in that strange suspension between past and present that old houses seem to hold in their bones. She pressed a hand to the doorframe to steady herself, though it was not her body that trembled. It had begun, all those years ago, with such warmth. The brother had arrived in autumn, cloak still damp from the drive, laughing in that easy way of his that filled a room before he did, and within a day he had charmed the cook, the stable boy, even the dour old butler who trusted no one on principle. He spoke of the woods behind the east meadow, of mushrooms he'd gathered as a boy with their late father, of a supper he wished to prepare himself as a gift, a small thing, he'd said, modest, but from the heart. The family had been delighted. Her husband, younger then and eager for his brother's affection after years of distance between them, had practically embraced the idea, insisting the kitchens be given over entirely to him for the evening, that no servant interfere, that this be his brother's moment to give rather than simply receive. She remembered the girl's face at the time, Not the workman before them now, but the housemaid, quiet and watchful, standing near the larder door with a basket of linens balanced against her hip, saying nothing, while the family laughed and planned and gave the brother free rein of the pantry keys. She remembered thinking little of it then, only that the girl had lingered a moment too long near the shelves of dried herbs before curtsying and withdrawing. The brother had spent 2 full days in the woods, returning each evening with baskets covered in damp cloth, humming to himself as he sorted his findings in the scullery, long after the rest of the house had gone to bed. He would not let the cook near the baskets, would not let anyone examine what he gathered, only smiled and said it was a surprise, that they mustn't spoil it, and they, trusting fools that they'd been, had allowed it, had toasted to his return, had spoken eagerly of the feast to come, had never once thought to ask why a man so long absent from the family's daily life should suddenly wish to feed them all himself. The crowbar bit deeper into the panel now, and another groan of wood split the stillness of the larder, closer this time, more insistent, as though the house itself were exhaling something it had swallowed decades before. She found she could not look away from the dark gap widening in the shelving, some part of her already dreading what daylight might finally uncover. The past folded back into that widening gap as easily as smoke slipping under a door, and she found herself once more in that low-ceilinged larder, years before, candle in hand, the smell of damp earth and gathered fungi thick in her nose. It had been early morning, the household still asleep, when she had gone down to fetch the ham for breakfast, and found the baskets left uncovered for the first time, their contents spilling into the gray light through the high window. She had crouched, skirts brushing the stone floor, and looked without meaning to look at all, the way one's eye is drawn to a crack in a wall. Among the honest brown caps and the pale gray ones, she recognized from her mother's kitchen garden, in another county entirely, there had been others, pale, almost luminous things, with rings about their stems like collars, growing not among the wholesome varieties by accident, but tucked beneath them, hidden, the way a bad coin is hidden beneath good ones in a purse. She had seen death caps once before, on a walk with her mother as a girl, and had been told in a voice that brooked no forgetting, "These you do not touch, these you do not even breathe near, these have ended whole families in a single sitting." Her hands had trembled as she lifted one from the basket, turning it in the thin light, and there could be no mistaking it. She had gone at once to the cook, a broad, red-faced woman with flour, always dusting her forearms, and had tried to explain, quietly, respectfully, what she had seen among the gathered mushrooms. The cook had barely glanced up from her dough. What would a housemaid know of mushrooms gathered by a gentleman, she had said, her tone not unkind but final, the tone one uses with a child who has misunderstood something simple. The master's brother had hunted fungi since he was a boy in these very woods, she'd said, and would know poison from supper better than any girl fresh from below stairs. Best she keep to her polishing and leave the kitchen to those who understood it. She had tried once more, gently, saying only that perhaps the baskets ought to be looked over again, that a mistake might easily be made in poor light among the leaves, but the cook had waved her off with a floured hand, already turning back to her bowl, already dismissing the matter as the fretting of someone who did not know her place. She had stood there a moment longer, the candle guttering, the baskets waiting silent and deceptively ordinary on the table, and had understood with a cold certainty that no one in that house would believe her unless she found some other way to make them listen, or to act without their believing her at all. The rain had not stopped all week in the autumn of 1899, and the west wing of the old manor smelled of wet stone and years of shuttered air when the workmen finally came to open it. The family had decided, after so long, that the wing would live again, new plaster, new windows, the dust of a dozen forgotten summers, swept away at last. The larder at the end of the old servants' passage had been locked since anyone could remember, its key lost or thrown away in some housekeeping long past, and it took a crowbar and 2 strong backs to force the swollen door from its frame. Inside, the air struck cold and stale, thick with the smell of old iron and dry rot. A lantern was brought forward, and its light fell across shelves furred with dust, a scatter of broken crockery on the floor, as though someone long ago had dropped a basket and never returned to gather the pieces. Cobwebs hung in gray ropes from the ceiling beams. One of the workmen, a young man with a scar over his eyebrow and little patience for ghost stories, muttered that it was no wonder the room had been shut up. Nothing in it but rubbish and rat droppings. It was the older of the 2 men, a stonemason by trade, who had worked on half the houses in that part of Surrey, who noticed it. He had run his hand along the back wall out of habit, testing the mortar the way he tested every wall he was asked to touch, and felt beneath his palm a seam that should not have been there. The stone did not match its neighbors, too even, too deliberately fitted, as though someone had wanted it to look like part of the wall and nothing more. He knocked upon it with his knuckles, and the sound that answered him was hollow, wrong, a small pocket of emptiness where solid stone ought to have been. He called the younger man over, and together they studied it by lantern light, running fingers along the edges until they found the place where a thin blade might be worked in. It took some minutes of careful prying before the panel gave way with a groan of old hinges no one had oiled in over a decade, swinging inward to reveal a shallow recess built into the depth of the wall itself, a space no wider than a chest, no deeper than a man's forearm, clearly meant to be found by no one at all. Dust rose in a pale cloud as the lantern light reached inside, catching on something dark and leather-bound, and beside it, the shape of a satchel, its strap gone stiff and cracked with age, resting exactly where it had been left, untouched, for 12 long years. The kitchen at Ashcombe Manor in the autumn of 1887 had never felt so much like a battlefield. Copper pots gleamed along the walls, catching the firelight in restless flickers, while the cook barked orders to 2 scullery maids, too flustered to keep pace. The great dish sat at the center of it all, a ragout of wild mushrooms, glistening dark with butter and wine, its aroma rich enough to draw praise before it had even left the stove. She had tried, only an hour before, to speak plainly to the housekeeper, to explain what she had seen in the basket left by the game larder, certain caps too pale at the gill, certain stems bruised in a manner no innocent mushroom bruised. She had been dismissed with a tired wave of the hand and a warning not to trouble herself with matters above her station. There had been no time left to seek out the master himself. The dinner bell would ring within the half hour, and already she could hear the murmur of guests gathering in the hall above, the clink of glasses, the low, warm laughter of a family who trusted the man who had prepared their feast. She stood at the threshold of the kitchen a moment longer than she should have, feeling the weight of what she was about to do settle into her hands like cold water. There was no proof yet, nothing she could hold up and say, "Look, here is the danger, here is the lie beneath the smile." There was only the certainty that came from years of watching hedgerows and forest floors as a child, of learning which fungi fed a family and which one buried it, and there was the quiet, terrible knowledge that if she waited even 1 hour more for someone to believe her, it would be too late to matter. So she moved. She crossed the kitchen with a steadiness she did not feel, reaching for the great dish just as the second scullery maid turned toward the pantry for the serving platters. In one motion she tipped the pot toward the slop bucket meant for the pig pens, the dark sauce sliding free in a single unstoppable wave, mushrooms and all, gone before anyone could cry out to stop her. She did not linger to watch the horror bloom on the cook's face, nor the scullery maid's hand flying to her mouth. She only pressed the empty pot back onto the stove, murmured something about a burn on her palm from the handle, and stepped back into the shadows of the kitchen as footsteps came pounding down from above, the master's voice already rising in confusion, then anger, demanding to know what had become of his brother's carefully prepared feast. She said nothing. She only waited, hands folded, for the storm that she knew was coming. The dining room emptied of its warmth within minutes, guests rising from their half-poured wine like startled birds, napkins abandoned on silk laps as word spread that the evening's centerpiece had vanished into a slop bucket meant for pigs. She stood in the passage between kitchen and hall, still as a post, while the master's face turned the color of the claret nobody would now drink. His brother arrived at his shoulder a moment later, and it was his expression she watched most closely. Not anger, not even surprise, but something quicker and colder, a flicker of calculation immediately smoothed into wounded disbelief. "Who did this?" the master said, and it was not a question. The cook, trembling, pointed. She did not deny it. There was no version of the truth she could offer that would sound like anything but madness. A housemaid, claiming to know poison from supper better than the man who had gathered it himself with his own gloved hands. She only said, quietly, that the dish was not safe to serve, and that she was sorry for the manner of it, though not for the doing. The mistress's voice rose sharp with humiliation in front of her guests, demanding an explanation that made sense, and when none came that satisfied the room, the master turned his back on her entirely, as though the sight of her offended something deeper than the ruined evening. The brother said nothing at all, merely stood with his hand resting gently, sorrowfully, on his own brother's shoulder, the picture of a man grieving a stranger's cruelty toward his family. She was told to gather her things before the guests had even finished making their apologies and departing into the cold October night, their carriages rattling away down the drive without the feast they had been promised. No one asked her to explain the burn on her palm, nor why she had chosen that dish above all others to destroy, nor why her hands had not shaken doing it. They asked only that she be gone by morning, and the housekeeper, tight-lipped and unable to meet her eyes, packed her small trunk herself, rather than trust her to do it, as though she might slip something valuable from the house on her way out the door. She left before dawn, walking the long gravel drive in the dark, with her trunk against her hip, past the gatehouse, where the lamp had already gone unlit, past the hedgerows silvered with frost, and did not look back at the house that had, for a little while, felt almost like a place she belonged. Behind her, in a larder no one thought to search, a satchel waited in silence for a truth that would take far longer to surface than anyone in that house could have imagined. The West Wing had stood shuttered for 12 years, its rooms given over to dust sheets and silence, until the summer of 1899 brought scaffolding to its crumbling facade and workmen with crowbars to its locked doors. The old lord, his hair gone entirely white now, his shoulders stooped in a way they had not been on that October night so long ago, had finally decided the wing should live again, restored, aired, open to light. His wife, walking the corridors with a ledger of repairs in her hand, had insisted the game larder be cleared first, its shelves long empty, its walls thick with the smell of old stone and older neglect. It was there, behind a panel that gave a hollow sound when a workman's knuckle rapped it out of idle curiosity, that the wall was found to be false. Behind it, wedged into a cavity no wider than a coal scuttle, sat a leather satchel gone stiff with age, a pair of gloves stained dark at the fingertips, and a small journal bound in oilcloth, its pages foxed and brittle, but legible still. The workman brought it to the housekeeper, who brought it to the lord himself, and he sat with it a long while in the unlit larder before he could bring himself to open the cover. Inside were sketches, careful, almost loving sketches, done in a hand he recognized at once as his brother's, of pale caps and white gills, of stems with skirted rings, each one labeled with small, precise notations: death cap, destroying angel. Beneath them, dates. Beneath the dates, notes that made the old man's hands go cold even in the summer warmth, calculations of shares and entailments, of what might pass to whom, should certain lives be shortened, should the line narrow rather than widen, should a brother's children never come to inherit what a brother himself might claim instead. There was no confession in so many words. There did not need to be. The sketches matched the very mushrooms that had once been meant for a dinner nobody in that house had eaten, and the notes matched a hunger for inheritance that nobody in that house had ever spoken aloud, though perhaps some had long suspected it and simply lacked the courage to say so. The Lord's wife found him still sitting there when she came looking, the journal open on his knee, his face the color of the dust sheets that had shrouded the room for over a decade. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said a name, not his brother's, but another's, the name of a young woman who had once burned her palm carrying a ruined dish out of a dining room while a house full of guests looked on in horror and blame. He said her name as though he had only just remembered, after all these years, that it was a name worth saying at all. Amara. The word left him like something dislodged after long pressure, a stone worked loose from a wall that had stood so long nobody remembered it was holding anything back. His wife stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to the frame, watching her husband's face crumple in a way she had not seen since the day their own son had nearly drowned in the ornamental lake as a boy, all those summers ago. "What did you say?" He did not answer directly. He only turned the journal toward her, his finger trembling against the sketch of the pale, deadly gilled thing that had so nearly graced their table 12 years before. She read the notes beside it, the careful, damning arithmetic of a man calculating who stood between himself and an estate, and by how much a family might be shortened to close that distance. She read it twice, before the meaning fully settled, before the ruined dinner she had raged about for over a decade rearranged itself in her memory into something else entirely. Not carelessness, not spite, not the clumsy sabotage of an ungrateful servant, but a hand reaching out in the dark to catch them all before they fell. "She saved us," the lady said, and her voice broke on the last word. "She saved every one of us, and we sent her away in disgrace." They did not speak for a long while after that. There was nothing to be gained by shouting, no comfort in blame thrown at a house already half in ruins around them. Instead, they sat with the terrible clarity of it, the years spent believing themselves victims of a housemaid's failure, when in truth they had been the unwitting beneficiaries of her quiet, unthanked courage. The Lord thought of her scalded hand, wrapped in a servant's apron, while the family looked on with cold suspicion instead of concern. The lady thought of the letter of dismissal she herself had signed, her handwriting so steady, so certain, so wrong. By the following morning, they had resolved what must be done. Inquiries were sent quietly to the village, to the rectory, to the shopkeepers, to anyone who might remember a woman who had once served at the manor and vanished from it under a cloud that was never truly hers to carry. It did not take long. She had not gone far, as it turned out. She had never gone far at all, only to a modest lodging on the village's edge, where she had lived these 12 years, keeping to herself, taking in mending, tending a small garden, speaking to no one of the manor or what had happened there, as though she had decided long ago that the truth, unbelieved once, was not worth offering twice. The Lord went himself, on foot, without announcing his intent, to a single soul in the house, as if some part of him understood that this was not a debt that could be settled by messenger. The cottage door was painted a faded green, its garden edged in autumn asters gone to seed. She opened it to find him standing there, an old man now, hat in hand, the years having softened what had once seemed so unassailable about him. For a long moment neither spoke. Then he said her name, not the cold word housemaid that had followed her from the manor like a shadow, but her actual name, spoken as though it had weight, as though it mattered. He told her of the false panel, the satchel, the sketches with their careful, damning notations. He told her what the journal had said, in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere had she ever been permitted to see it. He told her that his wife had wept reading it, and that he himself had sat a long while in the empty larder before he could trust his legs to carry him back through the house. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her apron out of old habit, though she wore no apron now. When he finished, she said only that she had wondered, sometimes, whether the truth would ever find its way home. He said it had taken 12 years, and that he was ashamed of every one of them. The following week, the household was gathered in the manor's entrance hall. Cook, groundskeepers, the new housemaids who knew nothing of the story, except what they'd been told to prepare for, and she was brought in not through the servants' passage, but through the front door, on the Lord's own arm. He spoke before them all, his voice steadier than he expected it to be, and told them what she had done that autumn night years before, how she had seen what no one else had seen, how she had ruined a dinner to save the lives seated around it, how she had been driven from the house in disgrace for an act of quiet courage no one had thought to question. The staff did not know what to do with such news except to fall silent, and then, one by one, to bow their heads to her, an old cook first, then the youngest kitchen girl, until the gesture moved through the hall like something passed hand to hand. They gave her the cottage at the estate's edge outright, deed in her name, along with a settlement sufficient to want for nothing. She planted a garden there that following spring, larger than the one she'd kept in hiding, and visitors to the manor were told, when they asked about the quiet woman who sometimes walked the grounds with the family's grandchildren trailing after her, that she was the one who had saved them all, that her name, once erased from the household's memory, was now spoken there with the honor it had always deserved.